Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to drift into one of those stories that sits somewhere between history and folklore with just a little hint of unease. Nothing too dramatic, though you can keep the lights low and relax. This is more about long-forgotten moods and strange characters than anything that'll keep you awake. So, if you're curled up in bed, maybe with some tea that's already gone cold, perfect. We're in the right frame of mind. The story we're floating into is sometimes called The Raven at the Window. It isn't the kind of neat, packaged fairy tale you'd get in a glossy storybook. It's more like one of those tangled village tales passed down, reshaped, and probably embellished by people who had too much time on stormy nights. And as usual with these sorts of things, it straddles that blurry line between could this have really happened and wow, somebody clearly needed better hobbies in the 1800s. Now, if you've ever spent time around ravens, you know. Those glossy, bow-sized crows who look like they've just walked straight out of a metal album cover. You'll know they already carry a lot of baggage. They're clever, mischievous, and unnervingly observant. Every culture that noticed them, which is basically all of them, decided they must be supernatural. Because why not? If a bird is smart enough to steal your lunch and remember your face, years later, people are going to assume it has some connection to the underworld. But the raven in our story isn't Odin's loyal messenger, or Edgar Allan Poe's gloomy houseguest. It's a little different. This raven is, well, just a raven, but with a handicap and a knack for being in the wrong or right place at the wrong time. And the girl it encounters isn't exactly a stable heroine either. She's young, she's intense, and she's drawing demons in charcoal while her mother tries to force her into exorcisms. You know, just your typical wholesome domestic life. So let's set the scene. The time isn't perfectly fixed. Somewhere in that hazy late 19th century stretch in the American Northwest. The Cascade Mountains are out there, misty and overbearing. There's a fishing village, a scatter of timber houses. The usual sharp divide between the nice side of town with manicured yards and umbrellas, and the rougher side where families scrape by with vegetable patches and very empty refuse bins. It's the kind of place where children knew everyone's business, and ravens could eat better by raiding the wealthy trash than by hunting in the wild dot and in the crook of a sugar pine. High up above the village, our raven was born. Like most baby birds, it began life as a ball of impatience and screeching hunger. But when the big moment came, the first flight, things went wrong. His right wing worked fine, his left wing not so much. Instead of gliding gracefully into adulthood like his siblings, he tumbled comatose, smacked into the ground, and realized very quickly that life was not going to be fair. Now, if you know anything about raven society, and yes, they do have society, it's not exactly kind to the weak. Birds who can't keep up get abandoned. Or worse, there's an account of a raven uncle, born with a club foot, who was eventually mobbed by his own kind. His eyes pecked out, left blind and dirty, because nature, as we all know, is a supportive and nurturing place. And so our young raven, damaged wing and all, understood immediately, adapt or die. Which is kind of the eternal motto of all survivors, feathered or otherwise, and adapt he did. He learned to fly crooked, compensating with his strong wing, always, veering sideways and correcting at the last second. He learned to move by night when others slept, blending into the dark until the moon felt like a second mother. He learned that refuse bins behind the big houses held feasts of half-eaten chicken legs and lamb fat, infinitely preferable to carrion. He was not exactly majestic, but he was clever, and clever counts. Meanwhile, in one of those houses, with a decent view of the street below, sat a girl named Matilda. She preferred to be called Mattie. Nobody listened to that preference, of course, because when you're a child in the 19th century, your opinions are about as valuable as a bent nail. Mattie's world was complicated. She lived with a mother who was devout, anxious, and constantly worried her daughter was drifting toward the devil's side of things, and Mattie did very little to reassure her. Because while other children drew sunny gardens and angels, Mattie sketched creatures with candle wax yellow eyes and too many teeth. She loved her charcoals, the deep black dust covering her hands like a badge of honor. And while her mother smiled nervously for visitors and explained her daughter's talent, she also whispered to the local priest about dark influences. The priest in question was Father Fairweather, a name that sounded cheerful but matched about as well as calling your surly uncle happy. He was tall, grey, severe, and walked around with that aura of self-importance common to men who believe God personally approves their every frown. He came to the house, uninvited of course, because priests in small towns never ask. They arrived and immediately decided Mattie needed spiritual correction. Correction in those days meant rituals, words muttered over her, hands placed on her head, maybe even a little tying down if she got too wriggly. You know, nothing traumatizing at all. Mattie hated it. She hated the priest. She hated her mother's nervous compliance. And she especially hated being called a very good little artist. Because nothing says patronizing quite like diminishing someone's unsettling demon sketches to a Sunday hobby. Now, Mattie wasn't entirely alone. In her mind, or perhaps her dreams, there was a figure named Bernard. Bernard, according to her, was the son of a Wendigo and a witch. So, you know, the usual extended family tree. He was skeletal, crooked, and draped in rags, with hypnotic yellow eyes. He whispered to her during those rituals, "Lie still, smile, no more screaming. Worship me, and someday I'll take you away." Which, to a girl trapped in a house of pastel crayons and forced politeness, sounded like a pretty good deal. She drew Bernard constantly. Sometimes he was grotesque, sometimes almost noble. The more she drew him, the less he appeared in her dreams, as if he was satisfied by her attention. A demon with an artist's ego. And in the meantime, her mother was lying to the priest. "No more nightmares," she'd say. "No more screaming at midnight." Which of course was not entirely true. But what is parenthood if not a long series of semi-convincing lies to authority figures? And this is where the raven and the girl finally cross paths. One night, Mattie sat at her desk, finishing another drawing. Downstairs, her mother had passed out after a broken bottle because, naturally, maternal alcoholism and demon sketches make an excellent household pairing. Mattie leaned close to her window. She loved the night. It was hers. The sky pressed close, like an embrace that didn't hurt. She felt calm until she saw it, a raven, glossy and black, peering in at her with those cold eyes. Her first thought wasn't, a bird. It was Bernard. Of course it was. Birds roost. At night, they don't tap on windows, unless they're demon messengers. And so she stared, wide-eyed, torn between fear and fascination. The raven tilted his head, curious. She opened the window. For the raven, this was a gamble. He'd been drawn to that pale face at the window, the way she smiled at the night as he did. Something in her looked like kinship. And so, Instead of flying away, he hopped inside. He crouched low, trying to make himself small, ready if she decided to wring his neck. He'd been rejected before by his mother, by his siblings. Why not by this human too? But then she touched him, her fingers against his feathers, tentative, testing. And he cooed, soft as a dove, curling closer like a kitten. For a creature who had never known gentleness, it was everything. Mattie blinked. The huge black bird nestled against her hands, warm and alive, not Bernard, not evil at all. Maybe even the opposite. A protector, and so the story of the raven at the window begins. Not quite a fairy tale, not quite a ghost story, something in between. A tale of a broken-winged survivor and a misunderstood girl, two outcasts, finding if not salvation then, at least a moment of recognition in each other's eyes. All right, so we left off with Mattie and the raven finally bridging that quiet, fragile distance between them. A girl convinced she's haunted, and a bird convinced he's defective, suddenly finding each other in the lamplight of a cramped little room. It's almost sweet, if you squint past the fact that both of them carry a freight train's worth of baggage. But then again, that's kind of the whole charm here. Nobody ever remembers the well-adjusted characters. Now, let's ease back into the room. The kerosene lamp flickers. The smell of wax and charcoal hangs thick. Mattie's fingers stroke the raven's feathers, each touch careful, almost reverent. For her, it's a test. Can she touch something without it burning? Can she connect without being hurt? For him, it's the first time another living thing has touched him with anything resembling care. And so, the two sat there. A girl and her crooked raven, an exorcist's nightmare, a bedtime story in reverse. Outside, the village was settling into its night rhythm. Dogs barking, fishermen shouting one last time before the tide swallowed their voices. But, in Mattie's room, the quiet was absolute. The kind of quiet where your own breathing feels like an interruption. She whispered, just once, almost to herself, "You're not Bernard." The raven blinked, as if to say, thank goodness. Now, it would be lovely if that's where the story ended. Girl finds companion, bird finds solace, everyone drifts into a comfortable sleep. But of course, nothing is ever that neat, because Mattie's mother still lurked downstairs, and Father Fairweather was still scheduling his cheerful little interventions, and Mattie herself still carried Bernard in her mind, that skeletal figure demanding loyalty. And, well, ravens, as clever as they are, don't exactly blend into family life. Let's drift over to the days that followed. The raven began visiting regularly. He learned the rhythm of the household. When the mother stumbled to bed with a bottle clutched in her hand, he would swoop down into the yard and wait for Mattie's signal. Sometimes he tapped the window. Sometimes he just perched, watching until she opened it. By day, he hid. By night, he belonged to her. Mattie gave him scraps. Not the boring potato peels from her own kitchen, but bits she scavenged when her mother wasn't looking. Bones, fat, little treasures of waste no one else noticed. He, in turn, became her secret, her dark bird, her proof that she wasn't entirely alone in her strange little world. And, of course, she drew him, dozens of times. Her raven, rendered in black lines across dozens of pages, each sketch a little more real, a little more defiant. Bernard was still there, skulking in her imagination, but the raven was taking up space too. A challenger. It's worth pausing here to talk about what people thought of ravens in villages like this one. Because, as I mentioned earlier, nobody, ever thought of them as just birds, too smart, too persistent. Farmers said they were omens. Priests said they carried messages from the wrong side of the spiritual ledger. Old women, less concerned with church politics, said they were reincarnated souls. Sometimes lovers, sometimes enemies, sometimes nosy ancestors just unwilling to move on. In other words, everyone projected their own fears and desires onto them, which is exactly what Matty was doing. And Father Fairweather, well, he didn't need much of an excuse to see devils in every shadow. Matty's mother increasingly panicked about her daughter's drawings, confided that a raven had been hanging around the house, a big one, black as night, watching the kind of detail guaranteed to make a priest salivate. A familiar, he thought. Clearly, the girl was being courted by something beyond human. And of course, because subtlety was never his strong suit, he recommended another ritual, stronger this time, maybe even under the cardinal's supervision. Matty heard every word. She always did. The floorboards carried whispers, and she had learned exactly where to stand, ear pressed close, hidden from sight. And she understood perfectly. They meant to drag her back to that suffocating place of hands and prayers and ropes. But this time she had something different. She had the raven dot. Now, of course, the raven didn't know any of this. To him, it was simple. A girl who fed him, who touched him kindly, who let him roost in warmth instead of cold branches. He wasn't a demon, or a reincarnated soul, or a symbol. He was just a bird, stubborn and broken-winged, trying to live. But try explaining that to a household steeped in superstition. Try explaining that to a priest who saw devils in every knot of wood. Spoiler, they don't listen. And so the tension built. The priest's visits grew more frequent. The mother's drinking got heavier. And Matty, caught between her drawings of Bernard and her companionship with the raven, grew more defiant in silence. She stopped pretending, stopped coloring roses when Father Fairweather entered the room. She knew he'd already decided her fate. So why bother? The raven noticed too. Birds aren't human, but they're not stupid. He could sense her moods. The way her hand lingered on his feathers a little longer when she was upset. The way she whispered secrets against his wing. He learned the patterns of her breathing, the weight of her sadness. And if that sounds a little too poetic for a bird, well, spend enough time around ravens and you'll know they notice far more than we want them to. Let's float forward to one particular night. A storm rolled in from the sea. The sky bruised and swollen. Rain lashed the windows. The mother was collapsed downstairs, snoring, while empty bottles rattled faintly on the table. Father Fairweather had visited earlier, promising to return with news from the cardinal. Matty sat by the window, her charcoal poised, but instead of Bernard, instead of demons, she drew her raven. Again and again, feather upon feather, as if by drawing him enough, she could make him permanent. The bird tapped at the window. She let him in, and he shook the rain from his feathers, glistening in the lamplight. She whispered, "They'll take me away, but you won't let them, will you?" The raven tilted his head, inscrutable, black eyes unblinking. It wasn't a promise, but in her mind, it was enough. This quiet companionship undersieges the heart of the story. The girl, the raven, the mother, the priest, each locked into their roles, circling like actors who can't change their lines. And Bernard, the skeletal figure in the corner of Matty's mind, always waiting, always reminding her that escape is never simple. So let's stay here for a bit. We'll drift through the storm, through the whispers in the rafters, through the half-heard plans of priests and the half-finished sketches of a girl, because nothing explodes here. Nothing resolves neatly. This is not a story of battles. It's a story of slow pressure, of long nights, of a bird tapping gently at a window pane, while a child wonders whether she belongs to the living, the damned, or maybe just to him. So, where were we? Ah, yes. A storm outside, a raven inside, and Mattie caught in that fragile calm between fear and defiance. These are the nights that lodge in memory, when every creak of the house feels significant, when the air is too heavy with possibilities. Of course, most of the time, nothing happens at all. But the human mind isn't particularly skilled at separating dread from reality. And yet, something was brewing. Father Fairweather had gone to consult with his superior, the ominously named Cardinal Iscariot. Yes, you heard that right, Iscariot. Because apparently, if you're going to rise in church ranks, you might as well pick a surname dripping with subtlety. A man with that name was never going to specialize in handing out warm cookies and comfort. His line of work was suspicion, and his solution to most things, whether illness, melancholy, or unruly children, was to stamp the word possession on it and fetch the ropes. So when Father Fairweather returned from his pilgrimage to Astoria, he brought with him a sense of mission. He walked taller, frowned harder, and smelled faintly of sanctimony, as though he bathed in incense. Mattie's mother noticed immediately. She always noticed, because the man's approval was her lifeline. If he said Mattie was improving, she relaxed. If he said Mattie was damned, she wrung her hands, reached for another bottle, and begged for instructions. The dynamic was not particularly inspiring. Mattie, of course, noticed too. She was always listening, perched near the stairwell, tucked into corners, ears tuned like a cat's, and what she heard chilled her. The cardinal was intrigued by her case. He had given his blessing for another ritual, stronger this time, more binding, which, translated from church language, meant, prepare to be tied down again, little girl. Now, if you've ever been 12 and under, surveillance by both a nervous parent and an overzealous priest, you'll know it doesn't exactly inspire trust. Mattie's response was predictable. She folded deeper into herself. She stopped speaking entirely when Fairweather visited. She stopped pretending with the pastel crayons. She stared at the floor, which, naturally, only confirmed the priest's suspicions. Silence, in his mind, was never just silence. It was resistance. And resistance could only mean evil influences. Meanwhile, the raven kept coming. Each night, the same tapping at the window, the same hesitant hop inside, the same settling into Mattie's hands. He had no awareness of rituals or cardinals. He wasn't carrying prophecy. He was simply surviving. And in his survival, Mattie found her only consistent comfort. Every time he returned, she felt reassured. If he could endure with one broken wing, maybe she could endure too. The logic of a child, yes, but also the logic of anyone clinging to symbols in a hostile world. Let's float to one particular evening when Fairweather arrived unannounced. Mattie was upstairs with her raven, sketching in charcoal. She heard the heavy knock, the scrape of boots, the low murmurs exchanged downstairs. The priest's voice carried like a knife through wood, serious, firm, increasingly agitated. He was pressing for a date, an occasion, the ritual itself. Her mother stammered, hesitated, finally agreed. Mattie froze. The charcoal slipped from her hand, leaving a black streak across the page. Her raven stirred, sensing her change, and tilted, his head toward the stairs. What happened next wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Mattie stood, closed her sketchbook, and went to the loose board at the base of her armoire. Inside was her secret stash: charcoal sticks, scraps of paper, fragments of things she wasn't supposed to have. She touched them, reassured herself they were still hidden, still hers. And then she whispered to the raven, "Don't leave me." Of course, the raven couldn't promise anything. He only rustled his feathers, a soft sound in the stillness. But Mattie took it as an answer. Because sometimes survival requires treating coincidences as signs. Now, from the outside, nothing looked unusual. A priest visited, a mother fussed, a child sat quietly upstairs. To the village, it was just another household drama. But inside that house, things were hardening. The priest was drawing his lines. The mother was yielding. The girl was resisting. And the raven was becoming something more than a bird. He was a symbol, a confidant, a tether to something beyond the suffocating plans of men in black. It's tempting to ask whether any of this was supernatural. Was Bernard real? Was Mattie truly haunted? Was the raven more than a raven? But those questions, honestly, missed the point. In the 19th century, superstition and reality blurred constantly. Demons were convenient explanations for everything, from epilepsy to grief, and birds. Well, birds were just as easily transformed into messengers of heaven or hell, depending on the needs of the story. So what we're left with is not certainty, but atmosphere. A girl, a bird, a priest, and a mother, all trapped in a cycle of fear and mistrust. And the storm outside, always waiting, always watching. If you lean into the quiet of this moment, you can almost hear it yourself, the drip of rain down wooden siding, the distant crash of waves, the soft shifting of feathers in a lamplit room. Let's linger here, because before the ritual returns, before the next step of this tangled little drama unfolds, it's worth pausing in the silence. These still points, after all, are where history and legend are most alive. All right, let's drift onward. The quiet house, the rain-slicked streets, the raven tapping at the glass, it all leads toward one thing: the ritual. Father Fairweather wasn't the sort of man who let matters slide. Once the cardinal had given his blessing, the ritual was inevitable. In his mind, this wasn't cruelty, it was duty, which is, of course, the sort of reasoning that has justified more bad ideas than we could ever list in one lifetime. Mattie knew it was coming. She could hear it in the way her mother spoke, nervous, hesitant, always deferring to the priest's decisions. She could hear it in the tone of the villagers, too, when they passed on the street, curious, cautious, eager for gossip. Everyone knew, and everyone was waiting. That's the thing about small towns. Nothing ever really stays secret. A girl suspected of possession was the best entertainment on offer. The days before the ritual moved like molasses. Mattie barely spoke, barely ate. She spent her hours sketching. Not Bernard this time, but the raven. Over and over again. His bent wings, his glossy feathers, his unblinking stare. Each drawing was an anchor, a way of saying to herself, "This is real. He is mine. They can't take this from me." And the raven, faithful as ever, kept returning. Each night he tapped at the window. Each night she let him in. They didn't need words. They only needed presence. Her mother, meanwhile, drank more heavily. It was the sort of drinking that turned nights into blank spaces, leaving only broken bottles on the floorboards to testify. That time had passed. Perhaps she drank from guilt, or fear, or exhaustion. Or perhaps she just drank because it was easier than thinking. Whatever the reason, it left Matty more alone than ever. Alone, that is, except for the raven. Now, let's float into the night before the ritual. The house was tense, the air sharp with anticipation. Father Fairweather had visited that morning, laying out his plan with all the gravity of a general preparing for battle. He would return with the necessary items: water, candles, the book. Matty would be restrained, for her safety, of course. Her mother would be present to pray and lend strength. The ritual would be thorough. The cardinal expected nothing less. Matty sat at her desk that night, listening to the storm gather. Her lamp flickered low. The page before her was smudged with black, the lines of the raven merging and dissolving in shadow. She whispered into the room, as though to him, "If they tie me down again, don't leave me." The raven was perched on the desk itself, close enough to touch. He tilted his head, glossy eye catching the lamplight. A silent sentinel. What exactly did Matty expect him to do? Probably nothing. He was just a bird. But to her, he had become more than that. He was proof of her resilience, a companion who needed no explanation, no forgiveness. She imagined, in the hazy way children imagine, that he might fight for her, that he might shield her from Bernard, that he might carry her away. None of it realistic, all of it essential. Meanwhile, downstairs, her mother murmured restlessly in her sleep. Empty bottles clinked against the table leg as the wind pressed at the windows. The house itself seemed to breathe, old wood creaking with the weight of the storm. And upstairs, a girl and a raven kept their vigil. The morning came grey and heavy. Father Fairweather arrived early, boots crunching on the path, cloak damp from rain. He entered without waiting for invitation. He always did. The mother fluttered, pale and unsteady, but eager to show obedience. Preparations began, candles placed, water set aside. The Bible opened to the proper passages. It was all very orderly, very precise, which only made the dread worse. Matty, upstairs, heard it all. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She had learned long ago that noise only fed them. Instead, she looked at the raven, perched on her armoire, feathers sleek against the dim light. "Stay with me," she whispered again, and when the footsteps finally came up the stairs, slow and deliberate, she didn't move. She waited. The door creaked open. Her mother's voice, trembling. "Matilda, dear, come now." Father Fairweather's shadow stretched across the floorboards. The ritual was about to begin now. Don't expect fireworks here. That isn't this kind of story. Rituals are slow, heavy, oppressive. They draw their power not from sudden shocks, but from endless repetition. And as we drift into this next stage, that's what you should imagine. The suffocating weight of words repeated, of hands pressing down, of a girl trying to retreat into the one refuge left to her. Her raven, so let's pause here, on that threshold. The candles downstairs flickering, the storm rattling the shutters, the priest preparing his lines, the mother wringing her hands, and a raven, black and watchful, waiting at a window that looked out on a world Matty might never touch again. The binding words morning slid into a sluggish afternoon, as though even the sun was reluctant to witness what was about to happen. The little house smelled of damp wood and stale wine. Candles had been arranged in careful symmetry across the parlor, though their flicker only made the shadows seem deeper. Father Fairweather moved among them like a conductor setting a stage, checking wicks, straightening a cloth, adjusting the Bible to lie squarely on the table. His movements were deliberate, slow, swollen with gravity. He was a man who believed in appearances, in ceremony, in the sheer power of repetition. Mattie stood at the foot of the stairs. Her mother held her shoulder too tightly, fingers trembling with both urgency and fear. The girl's face was pale, blank, and unreadable. She had perfected that mask. No smiles, no tears, just stillness, resistance disguised as obedience. The raven, however, was nowhere to be seen. Not on her arm, not on the banister, not at the window. He had vanished into the storm hours earlier, and Mattie's chest ached with the emptiness of it. She told herself he would return, as he always did, but the hollow in her ribs said otherwise. Father Fairweather gestured to the chair at the center of the room. It had been dragged forward, stripped of its cushions, ropes coiled neatly beside it. The sight of them was almost worse than the chair itself. Quiet, practical, waiting. Mattie didn't resist when she was guided forward. She didn't resist when her wrists were bound, the coarse fibers biting against her skin. She didn't resist when her ankles were tied, because resistance, in this setting, was only fuel for their certainty. Stillness was the only weapon she had. Fairweather opened the book. His voice rang out, solemn, sharp, rising above the storm outside. Words in Latin, heavy and ancient, filled the room. To him, they were a sword. To Mattie, they were noise. To her mother, they were salvation. Each syllable landed like a hammer, pounding away at the fragile quiet inside the girl's mind. For a long time, nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. That was the secret at the core of all such rituals. They relied on patience. They relied on the steady erosion of willpower. The candles guttered, the ropes chafed, the words went on. And Mattie, eyes fixed on the far wall, let herself drift inward, into the memory of black feathers and sharp eyes. Then something shifted. Not in the air, not in the shadows, but in her. The exhaustion cracked, and from somewhere deep inside, a sound slipped out of her throat. Low, harsh, not entirely human. A growl, perhaps, or a sob twisted into something uglier. Her mother gasped. Father Fairweather's eyes flared with triumph. This was it. This was the proof he had craved. Words intensified. His voice rose, thunder against thunder. Spit flew from his lips. He pressed the crucifix to her forehead, hard enough to bruise. Mattie jerked, not from pain, but from the sheer force of his certainty. The ropes cut deeper. Her breath quickened. Her mother wept, and then there it was. The tapping at the window, soft, insistent. A beak against glass. Tap, tap, tap. Fairweather didn't hear it. He was lost in his crescendo, his syllables crashing over themselves. But Mattie heard. Her head snapped toward the sound, eyes wide. Straining against the chords, her chest tightened with something like relief. The raven was back. The tapping grew louder, faster. Tap dash tap dash tap dash tap. Shadows flickered as the bird flung himself at the glass. The storm lent him fury. His wings battered the frame, feathers scattering against the lamplight. Mattie's lips cracked open in the hint of a smile, small but sharp as a blade. Fairweather noticed then. He turned, his chant faltering. He saw the bird at the window, wild and insistent, black against the storm, his face twisted, half in fear, half in vindication. You see, he shouted to the mother, it manifests. The creature is summoned by her sin. But Matty's mother didn't answer. She had collapsed into a chair, weeping into her hands. The weight of belief, the weight of doubt it, was too much for her fragile frame. She rocked back and forth, murmuring prayers, eyes shut tight. The raven did not stop. He hurled himself against the window pane until cracks spidered across the glass. Tap, shatter. A gust of rain exploded into the room, scattering candle flames, plunging half the parlor into shadow. The bird burst through, feathers slick with storm, and landed on the back of Matty's chair with a scream that split the air. For a moment, everything froze. The mother sobbed. The priest clutched his cross. The girl and the bird locked eyes, and, in that silence, Matty laughed. Not the laugh of a child, not the laugh of a demon, but something raw and sharp and utterly human. A sound that said, "You cannot break me, not while he is here." Fairweather, shaken, scrambled to recover. He shoved the crucifix toward her once more, voice cracking as he resumed the chant. But the room had changed. The rhythm was broken, the order shattered. And Matty, bound though she was, sat taller, straighter, stronger, with a raven screaming, defiance above her. We'll pause here, at this collision point. The ropes tight, the candles guttering, the priest sweating, the storm roaring, and a girl no longer entirely alone. Because whatever happened next, whether miracle or madness, was no longer entirely under Fairweather's control. The storm did not abate. If anything, it deepened, each gust rattling the house as though testing its seams. The candles sputtered in their brass cups, dripping wax onto the warped wooden table. Father Fairweather's voice wavered, struggling to rise above the cacophony. The crucifix trembled in his hand. He was not used to opposition, not from spirits, not from storms, and certainly not from little girls. Matty sat bound, but taller than she had ever been. The raven clung to the back of her chair, feathers slick, beak parted in a scream that cut through Latin syllables like a knife through cloth. His wings twitched, spreading wide, as though daring the priest to make the next move. In that moment, the room's balance shifted. Fairweather was no longer the conductor of this ritual. He was its prisoner. Matty laughed again, not loud this time, but low, steady, like the beginning of a song only she and the raven could hear. Her mother whimpered in the corner, rocking, praying, too frightened to intervene. The ropes dug deeper into Matty's skin, but she didn't flinch. She only tilted her head to match the raven's angle, their gazes aligned. Fairweather tried to press forward. He raised his voice, bellowing the sacred phrases, forcing them out with the last remnants of his conviction. Spit flecked his lips, sweat streamed down his brow. He slammed the crucifix harder against her forehead, desperate for a sign that the ritual was working. But if Matty felt the sting, she didn't show it. Her eyes burned brighter, fixed on the raven, as though she were drawing strength directly from his feathers. And then the ropes snapped, not in one dramatic break, but in small, fraying whispers. The fibers gave way strand by strand, as though something unseen had been gnawing at them all along. Her wrists shifted, her ankles slipped free. Fairweather didn't notice. At first he was too lost in his incantation, but Matty noticed. Her fingers twitched, her shoulders rolled. The mask of stillness cracked into something sharper. Readiness. The raven shrieked once more and launched forward, wings beating, striking the priest's face with claws and beak. Fairweather reeled, dropping the crucifix, hands flailing at the black storm before his eyes. The Latin broke into a cry of pain. Candles toppled. Wax hissed on wood. The Bible slid from the table to the floor, pages scattering like lost prayers. Mattie rose. The ropes fell around her feet like shed skin. She stood without hurry, without fear. Her mother gasped at the sight, half in terror, half in awe. Father Fairweather staggered back, eyes wild, his certainty collapsing like a structure built on sand, unholy. He roared, striking at the raven, though his blows landed on empty air. Blasphemy. This is the work of but. The words faltered, because what he faced was not what he had prepared for. Not possession, not a devil summoned by sin. Just a girl who had found her own defiance, and a bird who would not leave her side. Mattie took one step forward, then another, bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The raven circled above her, a halo of shadow and storm. Her face, pale and calm, was not the face of a victim. It was the face of someone who had already decided. And in that decision, Fairweather saw something that unsettled him more than any demon, resistance he could not name, could not cast out, could not control. Her mother whispered her name, soft pleading. But Mattie did not turn. She walked straight. Past the priest, past the toppled chair, past the dripping candles. She walked to the window, shattered by the raven's fury, and looked out at the rain-washed world beyond. The raven landed on her shoulder. His feathers brushed her cheek. For the first time, she raised a hand to touch him, fingers sinking into wet plumage. The connection was quiet, steady. Final dot behind her, Father Fairweather sank to his knees, clutching his Bible as though it were a shield, muttering fragments of prayers that no longer carried weight. He had not banished a demon. He had witnessed something he could not explain, and that, for a man like him, was worse. Mattie lifted her chin. The storm lashed her face, and she laughed, not sharp this time, not defiant, but free. It rolled out into the rain, mingling with thunder, carried by wind. A sound not meant for priests, or mothers, or cardinals, but for herself and the black-winged companion who had chosen her. And if the neighbors, huddled in their shuttered houses, claimed later they heard strange noises from the Fairweather home, that night laughter wings, the cracking of glass wall, that was their story to tell. We'll pause here in the aftermath. The ritual undone, the priest broken, the mother undone by fear, and a girl no longer bound, standing with her raven. At the edge of the storm, one step closer to a future no one else had prepared her for. The storm passed by dawn. It left the town crouched in silence, roofs dripping, streets streaked with mud, shutters rattling on half-broken hinges. The people emerged slowly, as though the sky might still lunge back and strike them down. And when they stepped into the pale light of morning, they began to talk. Talk was the town's second language. It rolled over fences and between market stalls, carried on the steam of boiling kettles and the smell of bread pulled from ovens. And this time, all of it circled around the Fairweather home, around the priest who had not shown his face at sunrise mass, around the girl who had walked into the storm with a bird of ill omen clinging to her shoulder. Some said they had heard. It laughed like a bell cut crooked, breaking through the thunder. Some swore they saw a dark shape wheeling above the roof, not bird but shadow, wide as the house itself. Some muttered about windows bursting, about flames that refused to burn, about ropes that turned to dust when touched. None of them agreed. On the details, they never did. But agreement wasn't the point. The point was fear. The point was story. Father Fairweather stayed inside for 2 days. When he emerged, it was with a limp and a voice that had lost its authority. He told his version that the ritual had nearly succeeded, that the devil himself had broken loose to protect the child, that he had driven it off at great personal cost. But his hands shook too much as he spoke. His eyes darted. His voice cracked at the wrong places. The faithful noticed, and their certainty cracked with it. Meanwhile, Mattie walked the village streets with the raven perched on her arm or her shoulder, or the handle of the basket she carried to market. She did not hide him. She did not hush. Him, she let him caw and clack his beak and ruffle his feathers as though he owned the air. People stepped aside when they saw her. They crossed themselves. They whispered. But they did not confront her. Not anymore. Her mother, thin and pale, followed a few paces behind when she could, wringing her hands, eyes darting from neighbor to neighbor, as though begging them not to judge too harshly. But Mattie never slowed her pace. She never waited. She carried herself like someone untouchable, someone armored not with steel but with the simple fact of surviving what they had meant for her. And so the whispers grew. Children dared each other to run past her door at night, certain they would hear wings against glass. Women told each other to pour salt at their thresholds if she passed by. Men shook their heads and muttered about the dangers of letting her walk free, yet none of them acted. Fear was a fine leash. Only the raven seemed unbothered. He strutted on fence posts, cocked his head at gossiping mouths, sometimes even mimicked their words in a garbled, mocking echo. Once, when a butcher hissed a curse at Mattie as she passed, the raven repeated it back in a voice so sharp and strange the man dropped his knife. The meat hit the ground with a wet slap, and the whole street fell silent. After that, fewer dared speak openly. Fairweather grew more desperate with each passing week. His sermons turned into rants, long-winded warnings about corruption and sin, his eyes always flicking to Mattie if she happened to be present. But the more he thundered, the less the people listened. His certainty had cracked, and the villagers could smell weakness as keenly as smoke. They wanted spectacle, not stammering. They wanted answers, not excuses. And so the balance shifted. Quietly, almost invisibly, but it shifted all the same. The priest was no longer the voice of God. The girl was no longer a victim. Instead, she became something else. Not saint, not witch, but a figure to weave into their stories. A name to hiss when the fire burned low. Mattie, the one with the raven, the girl who broke the ropes. At night, she would sit by the broken window, one she refused to have mended, and let the storm wind creep in. The raven roosted close, sometimes brushing his wing against her cheek as though to remind her he was still there. And in that space between silence and sleep, she would whisper back to him, not prayers, not confessions, just words, soft and secret, shared with the only creature who had not asked her to be anything other than herself. We'll pause here, in the long echo of rumor and suspicion, where the village has begun to reshape itself around a girl who refuses to bow and a bird who refuses to leave. Whispers, if left long enough, will crawl far beyond their birthplace. They slip down trade roads, tuck themselves into travelers' packs, hitch rides on carts bound for larger towns. And so it was with Mattie's tale. Within a month, stories of the Raven Girl traveled farther than any of her neighbors had ever gone. They changed shape along the way. Some made her a demon's bride, others a miracle child. In every version, however, there was a bird at her side, and a priest made foolish. Such stories had a way of finding ears that wished they hadn't heard them. In a stone chamber miles away, beneath the gaze of painted saints and candles that never seemed to burn down, Cardinal Severinus listened. The messenger who delivered the tale stammered through the details, unsure of which were embellishments. Severinus said nothing until the man had finished. He merely tapped his ringed finger against the arm of his chair. Each tap measured, heavy. Finally, he dismissed the messenger with a wave. But in the silence that followed, his mind crawled with unease. He knew Father Fairweather an earnest, if plodding, servant, not prone to wild inventions. If half the story was true, something dangerous stirred, and danger, in the Cardinal's eyes, was only tolerable if it could be controlled. Back in the village, Mattie went about her days almost unchanged. The raven grew sleek again, his wings glinting blue-black in the light. He had learned new words, her words, mostly, little phrases he repeated in her voice, uncanny echoes that startled passers-by. She laughed when he did it, and sometimes whispered, new ones for him to practice. The sound unsettled her mother, who begged her not to feed him strange ideas. But Mattie only shrugged. He had carried her through a storm. Why shouldn't she share a few secrets in return? Fairweather, meanwhile, wore his desperation thin. His sermons grew frantic, warning of curses and creeping rot. He named Mattie without naming her, railing against a girl whose presence corrupted the village. But each word drove another wedge between him and his parishioners. They had begun to resent his trembling voice, his sunken eyes, the way he flinched at every crow's caw. It was easier to fear the girl quietly than to endure the priests. Panicked insistence. Still, not all were silent. One night, Mattie returned from market to find a charm nailed to her door, twigs bound with twine, marked with a smear of ash. The raven snapped it in half before she touched it, scattering the pieces into the dirt. But her mother wept when she saw it, whispering that worse would come. Mattie said nothing. She only set her hand on the raven's back, steadying herself against his warmth. The worst did come. A rider arrived at dawn, cloaked and stern, bearing the Cardinal's seal. He did not ask for lodging, nor food, nor greeting. He asked for Fairweather. The priest, pale and unsteady, received him in the church, but the village heard every word that followed. The Cardinal wished for an accounting. The raven girl must be explained, named, dealt with. Fairweather faltered through excuses, trying to save his reputation. But the rider cut him down with silence sharper than any blade. The church, it seemed, would decide the truth. When the rider left, Fairweather's eyes followed him with terror. He knew what it meant when the Cardinal's men took an interest. It meant scrutiny, it meant judgment, and judgment rarely ended in mercy. That evening, Mattie sat again at her broken window. The raven preened his feathers in the fading light, scattering droplets of water with each shake. She whispered to him, softer now, as though even the walls might be listening. And when he echoed her words, back half mangled but still hers, smiled. For the first time, though, there was a shadow behind it. Because stories, once they reached the wrong ears, never returned unchanged. We'll pause here, with the Cardinal's gaze stretching toward the village and Mattie's quiet evenings, beginning to tremble under the weight of someone else's attention. The Cardinal did not arrive himself, not yet. Such figures rarely step into the mud until the ground has been softened by others. Instead, more riders came. Not many, only 2, then 3, but each bore the seal, each cloaked in the kind of silence that made villagers drop their eyes. They asked questions that were not questions. How long had the raven been with the girl? What had Fairweather done to cleanse her? Did anyone remember signs from her infancy and natural dreams? Strange marks, voices carried on wind. The villagers, eager to please, eager not to be noticed, answered with half-truths and whispers that sounded braver when repeated in candlelight. Mattie felt the change before she was told. Eyes lingered longer, shutters closed earlier. A man who once sold her apples muttered that he had none left, though the stall behind him said otherwise. Children no longer dared her street at all. Their parents held them tight when she passed, as though the raven might pluck them away. And yet none of it reached her as sharply as her mother's silence. The woman spoke less and less, as though words themselves might betray her. Fairweather, caught between ruin and salvation, saw his chance. He humbled himself before the riders, pleaded for the authority to conduct a second right one sanctioned, one under their gaze. If he could succeed with their blessing, perhaps the stain of failure might wash away. Perhaps the whispers of incompetence would cease. The riders did not promise. They only watched, measured, and reported. The raven, oblivious to politics, grew restless. He spent hours circling the steeple, cawing until Fairweather stumbled from his study to shout at him, voice cracking, arms flailing. Mattie laughed once at the sight, the sound carrying across the square like a bell. It turned heads, it spread unease. The priest clenched his fists and swore under his breath that the girl had to be broken before she broke him completely. At night, the air shifted. Mattie felt it in her bones, the way the village held its breath, waiting. The riders lit no fires in their lodgings, but their shadows moved behind curtains. The raven perched on her bedpost, staring at the window as though expecting someone or something to arrive. She whispered to him, but he did not answer this time. He only cocked his head, feathers bristling, listening to what she could not hear. And then came the letter, a parchment sealed in red, delivered into Fairweather's trembling hands. The cardinal's words were brief, brutal. The girl would be tested again. If she withstood, she would be named witch, and the church would take her. If she faltered, if the ritual held, she would be purified, and her soul saved. Either way, the matter would be ended. The decision would not rest in the village any longer. Fairweather, read it aloud in the square, voice cracking on every second word. The villagers shifted uneasily, but none spoke against it. They were tired of being caught between terror and silence. A resolution, even one soaked in dread, was still a resolution. Mattie listened. The raven tight against her arm, his claws pricking her sleeve. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. She only breathed in, slow and steady, as though she had been waiting for this all along. The storm had not left her. It had only been circling back. We'll pause here, with the cardinal's decree settling like iron over the village, and Mattie standing at the edge of a second trial, one that will not end quietly. The square had been swept clean by dawn. The riders oversaw it, their boots tracking mud across the cobbles as they arranged the space like a stage. Benches were pulled forward, ropes strung to mark boundaries, candles placed in a circle that flickered with uneasy light even in the morning sun. Villagers gathered slowly, pulled by the gravity of spectacle, whispering behind hands. Children clung to skirts, their wide eyes darting to the raven perched atop the church steeple, feathers gleaming dark as oil dot. Father Fairweather stood at the center, gaunt and trembling, clutching the cardinal's letter as though it were both shield and noose. His voice rasped when he announced the rite, this time. Sanctioned, watched, judged by men who carried the weight of Rome itself. His gaze flicked toward the riders at every pause, searching for their approval. They gave none. Their faces were as cold and smooth as carved stone. Mattie was led forward, her mother at her side. The woman's face was hollowed with fear, but she said nothing, only pressed her hand to her daughter's shoulder until she was made to step back. Mattie moved without protest, her chin high, the raven swooping down to settle on her arm as though summoned. A hiss rose from the crowd, half fear, half awe. None dared cross the rope. The rite began. Candles guttered, though there was no wind. Fairweather's voice cracked as he recited the prayers, his Latin slipping into stammers. He sprinkled salt, drew chalk symbols that smudged under his shaking hands. The riders watched every motion, their expressions unreadable. The villagers leaned forward, straining for some sign, some omen, ready to claim it as truth. The raven grew restless. He shifted from foot to foot, wings twitching, eyes glinting like coals. When Fairweather raised the crucifix, the bird let out a single, sharp cry that split the air like glass. Mattie did not flinch. She only stared at the priest, her lips pressed into a thin line. The sound rolled through the square, and for a moment, even the candles seemed to shrink from it. Fairweather pressed on, desperate. He placed the crucifix against Mattie's forehead, muttering faster, louder. Nothing, no scream, no convulsion, no sign of torment. Only her stillness and the raven's steady cawing, echoing back fragments of his words in a voice too human. The crowd shuddered. Mothers pulled children close. The riders exchanged a glance, sharp and fleeting dot. Then the air shifted. A wind stirred that did not touch the banners or the trees, but only the circle itself. The candles bent toward Mattie, flames stretching as though drawn to her. She did not move. The raven flared his wings, and with a snap of his beak, every flame guttered out. Smoke curled upward, black and heavy, clinging to the air long after it should have dispersed. Silence fell. Fairweather dropped the crucifix. His hand shook too violently to pick it up again. He fell to his knees, gasping, words spilling from him in broken fragments. Devil, corruption, curse. But his cries sounded thin, small against the weight of what everyone had just seen. The riders stepped forward at last. One stooped, lifted the crucifix, brushed the soot from it. He turned to the crowd, his voice even sharp enough to cut the silence. She is marked. Whether by heaven or hell remains to be seen. The cardinal will decide. Gasps rippled through the villagers. Fairweather slumped, his mouth working wordlessly, stripped of authority. Mattie stood motionless, the raven perched like a crown upon her arm, feathers sleek with shadow. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, not pity now, not hatred alone, but something deeper, something that would linger long after the riders had gone. We'll pause here, with the second trial ended not in cleansing, but in uncertainty, and the cardinal himself called upon to pass judgment. Days passed with the weight of anticipation pressing down on the village like the thick air before a storm. Mattie remained mostly inside, the raven ever at her side, watching from windows and rafters, wings folded but eyes alert. The villagers, equally watchful, whispered behind drawn curtains, stepping aside when they saw her on the streets. The market felt emptier, quieter. Even the wind seemed hesitant, holding its breath as though waiting for some signal to move again. Fairweather cowered in his study, shuffling papers, muttering prayers. His faith, once rigid and unquestioned, had become brittle. Each time he dared glance out a window, he expected to see the raven tearing at someone, the girl casting some spell he could, not name, a hand raised in defiance. His authority was gone, replaced by fear that would follow him until his last days. The cardinal's arrival was unannounced, as far as the villagers could tell. No banners, no heralds, only a shadow passing the gates with men in black, riding behind, their boots thudding against the soaked cobbles. He was not a figure of spectacle, but of inevitability. When the messenger delivered the word that the cardinal himself would attend, the town sank into a hush, a tense expectancy that clung to walls and chimneys. Mattie sensed it before she heard the hoofbeats. Even the raven stiffened, feathers bristling, wings twitching as if reading the wind better than any human could. She had grown accustomed to the attention, but the cardinal's presence was different. He carried a weight that pressed into the chest, a certainty that could crush hesitation. And yet, she did not hide. She stood by her broken window, the rain glinting off glass and roof tiles. The raven perched tall, sharp-edged and ready. Her mother was near, hands pressed to her mouth, silent for once. She could do nothing now, only watch. The villagers peered from behind shutters, from doorways, some clutching rosaries, others crossing themselves again and again. And Fairweather poor, shattered Fairweather, had no words left to plead. Only a trembling gesture toward the girl, as though offering her as a shield, or perhaps seeking one himself. The cardinal rode into the square slowly, boots splashing. Through mud, cloak hanging heavy in wet eyes, like a pair of unyielding stones. His men flanked him, silent as shadows, every movement deliberate. The wind seemed to shift around him, carrying the scent of rain, smoke, and a hint of iron. He dismounted without ceremony, his gaze sweeping the gathered crowd, pausing only on Mattie and on the raven at her side. Mattie stood still, letting the silence stretch. The cardinal approached, slow and measured, and finally spoke. His voice was low, precise, resonant enough to reach the edges of the square. "Matilda Fairweather," he said, pausing as though testing the weight of the words on the air. "Have heard tales, I have seen reports, and now I come to see for myself." The raven cawed, short and sharp. Mattie's lips curved in the smallest hint of a smile. The storm in her chest tightened, sharpened. This was not a threat yet, not quite, but it was an assessment. The cardinal was measuring her, the bird, and perhaps the entire village along. With them, Fairweather sank further into the shadows of his own authority, murmuring under his breath, trying to find any words that might save him, save the girl, or save his place. His mother stood behind her, silent and frail, unsure whether to shield or release. And Mattie, calm, resolved, met the cardinal's gaze directly, feeling the full force of judgment, yet refusing to break under it. We'll pause here, on the edge of confrontation, with the cardinal's attention fully upon Mattie and the village, holding its breath for the next move, the next word, the next flick of a raven's wing. The cardinal stepped forward, every footfall deliberate, his gaze fixed on Mattie and the raven perched lightly on her arm. He spoke with measured authority, questioning her about the bird, the failed rituals, and the tales of strange happenings that had reached him. Mattie responded with quiet composure, offering no words of defiance, only a still certainty that spoke louder than any protest. Occasionally, the raven interjected with a sharp caw or a deliberate tilt of its head, as if translating her silent resolve. The cardinal searched for deception, for signs of possession, or any hint of vulnerability, but he found none. Time stretched, the tension palpable. The villagers watched from behind their doors and shutters. Mothers clutched children, and Father Fairweather trembled at the edges of the square. Her mother's hands were pressed together, knuckles white, eyes wide with anxiety and hope. But Mattie remained steady, a calm anchor at the center of a storm that had not yet fully cleared. The Cardinal's men shifted uneasily, unused to a presence so quietly impervious. Hours passed, yet the girl did not falter. At last, the Cardinal gave a subtle gesture to his men to lower their weapons, to step back. He did not speak approval, but he did not issue punishment either. In that deliberate silence, there was acknowledgement. Some forces, some lives, could not be governed by ceremony, authority, or fear alone. Outside, the storm had softened into a gentle drizzle, silver threads dancing in the dim moonlight. Mattie opened her window fully, letting the cool night breeze wash over her. The raven took flight for a moment, circling once above the rooftops before returning to settle on her shoulder. Its feathers glimmered with the faint reflection of the moon. And Mattie smiled softly, a gesture private yet resolute. Her mother exhaled finally, relief flooding her face. Father Fairweather retreated quietly, shaken, perhaps understanding, at last, that some matters were beyond his reach. The Cardinal departed with his men, leaving the village with whispered stories, questions unanswered, and a sense that something extraordinary had taken place. Mattie remained by her window. The raven coiled protectively against her, the night pressing gently around them. The village would speak of her for years, some in fear, some in awe, but she knew the truth. She had endured, she had chosen, and she had found a companion in the darkness. Together, they faced the night, untethered, unafraid, with the world beyond theirs to navigate as it would. And now, dear listener, it's time to dim the lights and let the story drift away. Mattie sleeps, the raven rests, and the night folds softly around them. Good night. We'll wait here together, ready for the next story when it comes.